Good morning. My name is Mark Takaguchi. I'm the Associate Director of Fine Arts at the California College of the Arts, and I'm so excited to welcome you here today for the first full day of Craft Forward. It's given me an opportunity to reflect. This is my 9th year at CCA, and I think this conference, Craft Forward, will in many ways will operate in many different ways. It'll be an introduction for some of you. It'll be an extension for many of you, a provocation for some, hopefully. But one thing it will certainly be is an acknowledgement. And to me, that's really important. I think representing the sustained efforts of makers, teachers, and supporters at CCA and beyond, this conference should be a celebration of what you've all and what we've collectively achieved. And I especially want to thank the community of craft people at CCA. Your sustained energy and commitment through the years, many of those years were lean years, as many of you know, culminates this weekend in 2.5 days of excited and productive dialogue. My friend and colleague, Deborah Valoma, where's Deborah? Right here. I want to thank you. She has this wonderful way of speaking about the importance of cultural continuity. You know, this is the respect for your elders, the way values and identities are passed down from generation to generation. And this same kind of process happens at an art school like California College of the Arts. I myself have benefited from working with all of you at CCA and learned so much in that process. And I'm really excited to see so many of our students and alumni here, students and young people from other places across the country and the world. So many people worked so hard to put this together. This conference was crafted from the beginning with so much effort, so much love, so much commitment. There are acknowledgments in our package today, but I want to call out a few people that especially went above and beyond. Mark Fox and Angie Wang are responsible for the design, which infuses the whole conference. Their commitment and love of craft is, I think, evident in every little detail. I myself spent hours putting together these, so I can tell you the handwork that it took to make these. Thank you, Mark and Angie. Our staff who supported us have been incredible. Molly Mitchell, who's not here today, was our website guru. She deserves a big round of applause. Julie Caffey, who I hope is in this room. Is Julie here? No. She was here. You've heard her name mentioned before. Without her, this craft conference just would probably be about 11 of us meeting in a parking lot at Burger King. So thank you, Julie, for every ounce of your energy, commitment, and intelligence. And I think about Glenn's comments last night, and the title of one piece really stands out in relief for me as sort of embodying the kind of ethos around this conference, and that is more love hours that can never be repaid. So many of you who contributed to this and contribute to the field, these discussions, your grace, your commitment, your ferocity in pursuing something that isn't always the cool thing to do, I have such deep respect for all of you, and I'm happy to be part of that endeavor. I have a few just announcements to make as well, which is we invite everybody who hasn't already signed up for the soiree to come and have a hoedown party with us on the San Francisco campus, which is just 5 minutes away by taxi. That'll start at 7 o'clock tonight, and there will be tickets available at the door. You do need to bring a credit card, but we'll process those. That'll be an opportunity, I think, after all this, the intellectual heft of this afternoon, to just kind of let your hair down, have a couple drinks, and see some wonderful performance work. Also, we're going to, at the end of the day today, we're going to try to have cabs set up for you. It was a little difficult last night. Apparently, San Francisco has about 11 taxi cabs that rotate throughout the whole city. And if you need anything during today or tomorrow, please go to our intrepid front desk folks, or ask myself or Deborah, anybody you see here. We really want this to be a communal event. We're so happy to host you. We're really excited to have you here. So with that, I want to introduce the Professor of Critical Studies, Ian Carter, to introduce the first of our panels and kick off a wonderful day, 2 days of conversations. Thank you.
Hi, people. Welcome to Craft Forward's first topic panel, Sensory Craft. Thank you all so much for being here, especially so early on Saturday morning. And a special thank you to Deborah Valoma, Director of Fine Arts at CCA, and the driving force, both conceptual and organizational, behind this conference. I'm so glad to see you all here. My name's Ian Carter. I'm a critical theorist and historian of race and sexuality, which is what I teach at CCA. But the reason that Deborah asked me to moderate this panel is that we're both dancers. For some years now, we've been talking about how our official knowledges, history and textiles, the things in which we hold credentials, connect and collide with our embodied knowledges as movers. As college professors who dance, we know in our bodies that what we know with our bodies doesn't get the same kind of respect as what we know with our minds. Further, as a textile artist, as a teacher of textiles, and as the chair of the textile program at CCA, Deborah's had to grapple with the low status of her craft. For instance, basket weaving, which is an ancient and complex practice with considerable cultural significance in many societies, in ours is most often referred to as a derogatory joke, an example of just how frivolous education can be. In our current academic Western culture, real knowledge is mental. Bodily knowledges are easily and routinely dismissed. Real knowledge is abstract. Concrete knowledges are generally regarded as naive. This panel's speakers show us that these are very limited perspectives on where knowledge resides and how it is communicated. The two papers we'll hear offer us critical perspectives on the hierarchy of the senses that make it so easy to dismiss what the body knows, and on the evolutionary links between handwork and brain development. Our panel's goal is to ground all further conversations for the day in a sense of physicality, because craft involves knowing, learning, and holding information in one's body, hands, and more. Both of our presenters work with the notion that humans have the ability to perceive, understand, remember, and transmit our understanding through multiple senses, not only through intellect, and not only through sight and hearing, the dominant senses in Western cultures. This panel leads off the conference because bringing craft forward demands that practitioners have ways to critique the dominance of the visual and the hierarchies of knowing that relegate craft practice to the cultural margins. First, we'll hear from David Howes. David Howes is professor of anthropology at Concordia University, Montreal, and the director of the Concordia Sensoria Research Team, CONCERT. He holds 3 degrees in anthropology and 2 in law. His main fields of research include sensory anthropology, culture and consumption, constitutional studies, and the anthropology of law. He is a leader in the field of sensory anthropology, which is dedicated to charting the varieties of sensory experience across cultures through in-depth investigation of the distinctive ways in which the senses are socialized in different cultures. Each culture has its own modes of distinguishing and combining the senses. These ways of sensing give shape to the normative patterns of experience in each society. To a greater or lesser extent, every domain of sensory experience, from the sight of an artwork to the scent of perfume to the savor of dinner, is a field of cultural elaboration. Howe has learned from field research in Papua New Guinea, the Andean region of Argentina, the American Southwest, and Oxford, that sensory experience may be structured and invested with meaning in many different ways. He has most recently completed an ethnographic analysis of current trends in multisensory marketing, and is currently working on a new media art project in collaboration with a colleague, Christopher Salter, that involves the creation of a chamber that plays with a wide range of sensory phenomena. Howe is the editor of The Varieties of Sensory Experience and Cross-Cultural Consumption and of Empire of the Senses, and the co-author, with Constance Klassen and Anthony Sinnott, of Aroma, The Cultural History of Smell. Finally, he has authored Sensual Relations, Engaging the Senses in Culture and Social Theory. His most recent book is The Sixth Sense Reader, and he is the managing editor of The Senses and Society, as well as co-convener of the Sensory Studies website, and he will be speaking today on craft, sensory power, and delight. Please welcome David Howes.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Deborah, for the opportunity to be here. It's a great honor for me as an anthropologist to be addressing you, and a particular honor to be on the same panel as Frank Wilson. Well, enter the term craft and the senses into Google, and what you come up with is page after page of children's books and activities on the five senses. I thought that was particularly germane to today's topic. There is, for example, the Five Senses Crafts and Five Senses Preschool Activities page on kidsoup.com. It reads, Five Senses Crafts and Five Senses Preschool Activities. Our five senses allow us to enjoy the world around us, the taste of our food, the sound of music, the beauty of sunrise, the softness of a cat's fur, and the fragrance of a rose. Children may recognize the importance of their senses, but they don't often focus on them individually. This month, we have created and gathered a multitude of games, activities, arts, and crafts, and resources to help your child learn about each of the five senses. They will experiment with sound by making instruments, guess what's inside a feely bag by using touch, investigate to find out why they can taste different flavors, and much, much more. Now, I must say that I would argue that well-meaning as these educators may be, their pedagogy is antithetical to the proper education of the senses and the cultivation of an aesthetic sensibility. One could point to the fact, first of all, that there are not just five senses. Indeed, editing The Sixth Sense Reader has introduced me to the notion that there may be as many as 33. So we're not teaching our children well if we're teaching them they're just five. Secondly, I kind of resent the implication that senses are for kids, especially as an adult. It implies all this literature on children and the senses, that one is supposed to grow out of your senses as you mature, something I guess I haven't done properly. But also, I think most difficult and most problematic is the idea that you need to train children to focus on the senses individually, or they can't enjoy them properly. Now again, this seems to me to be especially problematic. In order to show just how problematic it is, I'd like to put forward two representations of the creative process, which frame two very different understandings of aesthetic production and experience. The first one I'm going to call the perfection of perception. And it's represented by this painting from Remedios Varo, who lived between 1908 and 1963. And it's called The Creation of the Birds. If you look, you'll see that indeed this artist, an owl-like woman, is engaged in a complex multisensory process. There is a moonbeam that is directed through a prism onto the canvas in front of her. And she paints the birds with a palette that is actually composed of the emanation of a kind of alchemical vessel, which if you follow the tube actually goes out of the sort of window and presumably actually is drawing in the fragrance of the night air and transmuting it into color. Finally, the pen with which she draws, or the paintbrush, is attached to a violin around her chest. And so what you find here is a very profound and powerful sort of intimation of the integration of the senses. Varro suggests that the artistic process involves carefully blending and transmuting sensory modalities in these wistful acts of creation. And the result is not just another representation, but rather living beings, the birds, which fly off into the night sky, and in that regard are creations and not mere representations. I would compare that image Well, the next one, which is a very famous image that you probably know already. It's by Albrecht Dürer. It's called Man Drawing a Reclining Woman. And that image is one that has a very definite kind of resonance in terms of it actually being hearkening back to the very famous Italian author, artist, architect, and general polymath, Leon Battista Alberti, who in the 15th century invented, in effect, linear perspective vision. And that sort of invention one could talk about in terms of the perception of perfection. So as opposed to the perfection of perception, the perception of perfection. Now, the image will be known to you as one in which Alberti, who regarded mathematics as the common ground of art and the sciences, held that, in effect, one could turn to classical optics in order to determine perspective as a geometric instrument of artistic and architectural representation. The ultimate aim of the artist is to imitate nature, Alberti held, meaning that the artist must work or must undertake to represent things in such a way that they appear to the observer to be similar to the real objects of nature. However, Alberti did not mean that artists should simply imitate nature objectively. Rather, he held that the artist should be especially attentive to beauty, for in painting, beauty is as pleasing as it is necessary. Now, beauty was, for Alberti, the harmony of all parts in relation to one another, and subsequently this concord is realized in a particular number, proportion, and arrangement which is demanded by harmony. Now, in the image is sort of a man drawing a reclining woman. It's by Dürer, but it again harkens back to the invention of linear perspective by Alberti. And you'll see that the man sort of is looking through a grid at a woman who is the model, and he has his eye atop a sort of little spire, and he looks through the grid, and by virtue of the grid is able to get her proportions exactly right. Now, what's significant to me about this little device, which informed this new way of seeing, is the way in which it screens out all of the non-visual senses. There is obviously no conversation going on, no olfactory exchange, no tactual exchange, nothing, except for a transformation, a transmutation of the world into matter for a detached, observing eye. Now, this representation very well supports the idea of the artist as a master of all that he surveys. And given its sensory neutrality, the way in which all the non-visual senses are screened out, where else would you actually hang such a representation than in the sterile air of an art gallery or white cube? In effect, the design of the gallery is purposely not to include anything that might distract you from engaging in aesthetic contemplation. And that is very much achieved by virtue of the ways in which the other senses, the non-visual senses, are stifled by that process. Now, I want to suggest that when we look across cultures, we find far more art forms which conform to Remedios Varo's understanding of the aesthetic than to Alberti's. And by way of representation of that point, I present to you an image which comes from the decorative arts. This actually is a very poor slide, which is significant as well. But this decoration is actually typical of the decorative arts of the Shipibo. And what you find is that amongst this Amazonian tribe, these designs, similar ones, are woven into textiles, incised on pots and house posts, and also painted on faces. But it's in the context of the Shipibo-Kanibo healing rituals that they have their most important use. And in that regard, one of the things that one needs to know about what this kind of arabesque, this kind of geometric pattern is suggesting is very much an idea of intersensory harmony. That is, at the start of a healing session, what happens is that the shaman, under the influence of ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic vine, is supposed to see the body of the patient as if through an X-ray machine. And he sees that body as a squiggly mass of lines, confused lines. Also, the body emits a pathological aura and has a vile stench, which is the mark of the attacking spirits, which are supposed to actually be the cause of the disease. The shaman begins by brushing away the mess on the patient's body with his painted garment, which has these kinds of patterns on it, and fanning away the miasma of the attacking spirits with his fragrant herbal bundle. And all the while, he blows tobacco smoke and with a rattle beats out a smelling rhythm, as it is known. Following this, the shaman, still hallucinating, perceives sheets of these sorts of luminescent geometric designs floating downwards. And when they reach his lips, he sings them into song, and they are supposed to penetrate the body of the patient and give the body this sort of orchestrated visual contour as opposed to the disordered one that is there otherwise. At the moment of contact, then, what happens is that the visual pattern transforms into an acoustic one. Now, the whole time that the healing design is being sung onto the body of the patient, the Nayue, the evil spirits, will try to ruin the pattern by singing evil-smelling anti-songs that deal with the odor of gasoline, fish poison, dogs, and certain products of the cosmetic industry. And in this way, what you find is that there's a real contest, but ultimately the idea is that the actual fragrant chant of the shaman will prevail. The synesthetic interrelationship of the designs, songs, and fragrances used in these healing rituals is nicely brought out in the following lines from a shamanic healing song. The harmful spirit Numa swirling in your body's ultimate point, I shall tackle it right now with my fragrant chanting. I see brilliant bands of designs, curved and fragrant. Now, an important point to note here is that whereas we perceive these designs as visual abstractions, the Shipibo Kanibo perceive them as matrices of intersensory perception, since these geometric designs are at the same time musical scores and perfume recipes. In other words, they resonate in each of the senses. They are not simply addressed to the eye. Now, these designs are not pure in the way that, for example, a painting is pure or a musical composition is pure. And this brings us to a fundamental difference between art, particularly modern art, and the kind of craft that we see exemplified by this representation. In order to understand that difference between art and craft, I would like to draw on a quote from Bruce Metcalf, who has a piece called Modernist Theory, the Disinterested Gaze and the Autonomous Art Object, in the book Neocraft, which is about modernity and the crafts. And Metcalf writes, some of the most pervasive and least examined aspects of craft are its sensuous qualities, especially its appeal to touch. Reductive modernism, that is, aesthetics after Kant, and especially after the New York art critic Clement Greenberg, restricted aesthetic experience in the visual arts to sight alone, as if no other pleasure were possible. But craft objects, because they are used in so many ways, engage all or most all of the senses. When a pot is held, it conveys weight, balance, and density. Weavers and garment makers are conscious of the feel of different fabrics, from silk to denim. The material controls how the garment feels, how appealing it is, and how well it will insulate, and also how it will drape and weigh on the body. Now, none of these experiences rely on sight, but all of them have an aesthetic component. And this is that larger definition or understanding of the aesthetic as multisensory that I'm trying to approach. Metcalf writes, craftspeople intuitively make judgments of how sound or touch intersects with the visual, but never think much about it. Okay? Now I want to emphasize that word intersect that Metcalf uses. And in order to think further about that intersection, I think we have to inquire more deeply into how the senses are socialized, which brings me to the history and anthropology of the senses, and an explanation, I think, for the lowly status of craft that was mentioned by Ian relative to the so-called fine arts. Now, this lowly status in relation to art is at least partly due to the conventional Western hierarchy of the senses, which opposes sight to touch as mind is opposed to body, and which heaps honors on vision as the noblest sense, while relegating touch to the lowest, most primitive rung of sensory existence. This privileging of vision in turn informs the ranking of painting as the finest of the arts, and poetry or weaving, along with all the other so-called handicrafts, as belonging to the opposite manual or crude end of the value spectrum. A moment's reflection reveals the spuriousness of this classification. A painter needs more than a good eye to paint, just as a weaver needs more than dexterous fingers to produce textiles. Nevertheless, what we find is that this is the manner these intersensory relations have been elided in the way in which we represent art and crafts to ourselves. Now, this suggests that to properly valorize craft, we need to start by revalorizing touch. We need to start by revalorizing touch. Now, Frank Wilson has contributed majorly to such a revalorization with his book, The Hand. One of his most essential points is that the hand cannot be thought of as a single entity. Rather, it works in concert with the shoulder, in that the shoulder orients where the hand will go, and also with the other hand. Indeed, the dominant hand, or the hand, works around the other hand, ensuring the dominant hand is able to perform the needed task. I note here the relational approach to the understanding of the body that Frank stands for. It's not a serial or individuated approach. And in that regard, the anthropology of the senses very much agrees that we need to look at the relations between the senses in place of treating them in isolation or treating them severally, as in the five senses arts and crafts suggestion. Furthermore, Frank has argued that the brain is hand and hand is brain. In this regard, he brings out the intelligence of the senses and some of the respects in which the mind can be seen as an extension of the hand. In this regard, he transforms radically the conventional understanding of the hand as being simply a manual sort of device, as opposed to a form of intelligence in its own right. Furthermore, Frank brings out the sociality of tactility. Looking back in our evolutionary history, he points to grooming and the significance of grooming amongst primates, especially monkeys, where it can be seen that they spend a great deal of time grooming each other. And this is to maintain coalitions or allies. And this is obviously important to the formation of society. Now, in this regard, we can see the hand as at the origins of social connections. So the hand as having motivated the development of the brain, and the hand and the manipulation of the hand as at the origins of the development of social connections. The hand not only creates the conditions for socialization, however, I want to suggest, it is also socialized. One of the ways in which we can see that most immediately is the way in which we distinguish between the right hand and the left hand. And right and left are indeed hierarchized. Right stands for correctness, for everything's being in the right order or doing the right thing, whereas left, in Latin, it comes out very clearly, is connected with a more, dark side, a sinister side, and also the French gauche refers to the social ineptness or awkwardness of the left hand. So here then we see that socially the hands are hierarchized, and so too are the senses. Indeed, what we find is the senses are hierarchized along the model of the sexes. That is, you find the division of the senses corresponding to a division of the sexes, as in the notion of the male gaze and the female touch. Now, in bringing out this gender dimension, where I want to go next is to consider how Constance Classen has indeed, for her part, contributed majorly to a revalorization of touch, and in particular female touch, in her chapter on feminine tactics, or crafting and alternative aesthetics in the 18th and 19th centuries, in her book, The Book of Touch. What Classen takes on is the question, why are there no old mistresses the way there are old masters? Okay, why do we have so many old masters in painting but no old mistresses? Well, maybe, she suggests, we are looking in the wrong place, and that really what we should be doing is feeling. Classen delves into ladies' work in the 18th and 19th century by way of illustrating her point. All of the craft work created by upper-class women primarily as a leisure activity. This consisted of needlework, shellwork, papercraft, which is all intrinsically tactile, intimate, and extremely homely in effect. A classic example of such work was that of Mary Delaney, whose paper cutouts of flowers will, I'm sure, be well known to you, given your sort of exposure to this domain. And one of the interesting questions that is actually posed by these paper cutouts is how the artistry of these pieces lies not so much in their overall visual effect as in their intricate detail. The paper flowers are built up from hundreds of carefully cut pieces of colored paper pasted on a black background. Now, the question arises, because Delaney was actually not a bad painter, why she went to such trouble to cut them out and mount them, to actually sort of use their scissors in this way, and not simply paint the flowers and then mount them on the black background. But this was because scissor work was indeed considered to be a particularly feminine practice at the time, and remains so. And that work resulted in this actual form of representation being a triumph of feminine craft, as opposed to simply another pretty picture. Indeed, furthermore, the model for her flowers was the hortusicus, or dried flower collection, which many women, including Delaney, created as another dimension of their craft work. Now, the layering of leaves, petals, stamens, and so on in Mary Delaney's pressed paper flowers, which, it should be noted, were composed with botanical accuracy, mimicked the physical qualities of real pressed flowers. The result was a richly textured effect that would be readily accessible to the fingertips, but is less immediately apparent to the eye. After immersing oneself in the intricate patterns and textures of her work, a conventional painting of a flower might, by contrast, seem rather flat and dull. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to move very quickly through another example of female craft work, this one from the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, from the Parmenter sisters, a 16-sided house, or cottage really, because it's a thatched roof, which is supposedly modeled on a basilica in Ravenna. And what's remarkable about this particular house is that it involves a true expression of the female touch. Here you find that within the 16-sided house, there is an 8-sided sort of central hall, and then around that hall is this gallery on the second floor. And all of the walls of this gallery are indeed made of carefully chosen and positioned shells of various descriptions. And also there are murals between the windows, which are in effect not of saints as in a church, but rather of birds. And this gives you an impression of what it's like to actually look out one of these windows and see beyond. Now, what I think is significant about this form of work is its textural diversity. And in effect, what it above all and interestingly does is bring the outside, the view that you would have out of the window, inside, and gives the visible world a kind of presence that it would not otherwise enjoy. And this is an indication, I think, of a difference between these female arts, these crafts, and indeed the kind of position that we saw in the form of the representation by Alberti. Now, mosaic is a key element in this process. And in that regard, the mosaic elements here and the multi-perspectival kind of sort of space that results from having a 16-sided building with an 8-sided room inside it refers to or brings out some very important components to the way in which the tactile completes and actually fulfills the visual in this case. I will conclude by turning now to anthropology in the last minute, to talk briefly about a further respect in which we see actually an interesting convergence between my discipline, anthropology, and yours, in that apprenticeship has become a special topic for anthropologists to study in recent times as a model of education and also a fieldwork method. That is, increasingly, anthropologists have apprenticed themselves to craftspeople and in that way come to sort of appreciate in a much fuller manner than they otherwise would be able to the dimensions of craft and craft as a way of knowing. My colleague Trevor Marchand, for example, has worked with minaret builders in Yemen and mud masons in Mali. And the case studies that he has brought together of on-site learning and practice support what he calls an expanded notion of knowledge that exceeds propositional thinking and language and centrally includes the body in skilled performance. Crafts, he argues, are largely communicated, understood, and negotiated between practitioners without words, and learning is achieved through observation, mimesis, and repeated exercise. He further argues that the validation and promotion of skilled practice as intelligent, in his words, is necessary for raising the status and credibility of apprentice-style learning within our Western system of education. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into all of the details of minaret building amongst the builders of Yemen, but just one word to say that they build the minarets, which are next to the mosque, in a manner that involves a pole being planted in the ground, and then the stairs and also the outside casing is gradually built up around that. And in effect, it's all done with sort of not any kind of plan, not any kind of visual plan in mind, but rather it's done by means of thread that is fastened to the axial steel post. So in this way, the spiral staircase grows almost like a shell around its central support. And through Marchand's work, I think we arrive at a true appreciation of a form of building that is not grounded in mathematics, as in the form of Alberti, but rather in the senses, and that the crafts and skilled that is brought out in his piece show us ways in which the defining feature of crafts, in this case the building of these minarets, is their intersensoriality. And in that, rather than visualization, lies wisdom. Thank you.
Our second paper, Handmade Minds in the Digital Age, is by Dr. Frank Wilson. Wilson is a neurologist and internationally respected authority on the neurological basis of skilled hand use. Much of his career since the 1980s has focused on performing arts medicine, particularly on impaired hand control in musicians. He's also studied upper extremity injuries in textile designers at Levi Strauss here in San Francisco. He became the medical director of the Health Program for Performing Artists in 1996, and in 2001 became clinical professor of neurology at Stanford, where he studied deep brain stimulation for patients with complex movement disorders. He has also worked extensively on education, especially on how troubled kids do better with education that brings in physical learning. Wilson is perhaps best known for his book, The Hand, How Its Use Shapes the Brain, Language, and Human Culture, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in Nonfiction in 1998. This work draws evolutionary connections between hand skills and brain development. Now retired from clinical and teaching positions at UCSF and at Stanford School of Medicine, Wilson lectures, writes, and consults on a range of issues concerning the relation of hand use to human cognitive and artistic development, early childhood education, and the clinical evaluation and management of disorders of professional hand use. Please welcome Dr. Frank Wilson for Handmade Minds in the Digital Age.
Thank you very much, Ian and Deborah, Mark. I have a lot of other people I want to thank, but we have to move along, and I'm going to, the adventure is to find out how things work. Should that be working? I guess you like the slide. This slide sets out what I want to talk about, and the last thing on here. So here's what we're going to cover: a few million years of evolutionary biology, 2,000 years of cultural history, the impact of information communications design, engineering, technology on your lives, and the impact of all those technologies and the media on educational policy and the lives of children outside school. So we have to move right along. Actually, is Glenn here? He was here last night? Oh, I'm so sorry. But he said the thing I hate the most is reading slides from PowerPoint. So I'll try not to do that, and I try to make the print big on some of them. Anyway, I obviously am not going to do all the things that I would like to do, but, oh, there we go. All right. So the anthropologic question has to do with the human hand. I learned the hard way that it doesn't matter how much I talk about the hand. Almost everybody thinks that the human hand is just a nice, pretty refined form and a decorative opportunity for spas, but it's a monkey hand. And so I need to spend a little time explaining to you why that is not so, and it is so profoundly, importantly not so that I have to spend a little time on it. The second thing is about you all, and it turns out that you're in the same boat that people in medicine are in and people in lots of other professions and avocations are, which is that our lives have been recently very much changed by modern technologies. BCE doesn't mean before the Common Era, it means before the computer era. Artists spent considerable time and effort acquiring specialized hand skills. Now the question is, does the fact that a textile designer sits behind a CAD machine and never touches a piece of fabric, does that really make any difference? Not just in the quality of the life, and believe me, as a consultant for the Levi Strauss company here for several years as their designers were falling into very sad physical shape, and it wasn't for ergonomic reasons, it was because the Jews had gone out of their job. It's a real issue. But it isn't just that, it's also a question about how do the new technologies actually change the way people think. Try to touch on that a little bit. The next is the kids today question. Object-oriented manipulative experience is a biologically anticipated, I'm slowing down for a reason because I want you to remember this, precursor to and a potent driver of human neuromuscular and cognitive maturation. What do we know about the substitution of mediated, that means looking at it on a screen and through headphones, the substitution of that kind of experience for self-generated body-based experience in early human learning? Okay, next. This is kind of random, isn't it? All right, we're going to go back a long way to just try to focus on or to grasp how people started thinking about the relationship between the hand and the mind, hand and intelligence. And two people, we actually don't know much about Anaxagoras except that he was an astronomer. He lived about 100 years before Aristotle did. And what he said about this relationship, humans became intelligent creatures because of their hands. We only know that he said that because Aristotle quoted him. But Aristotle actually had a different idea. He said humans were given hands because they are intelligent creatures. What's the truth? We go for a long time with people thinking about hands and minds until the late Renaissance, and you all remember the late Renaissance, don't you? When this image popped into view, in which sort of what might have been thought of as the decline of the reputation of the hand in the Middle Ages was changed, substantially changed. And I would propose to you that 500 years later, we have the same kind of an opportunity and a crisis with the digital age. There's a very, very strong cyclic feel that, for me, that right now we have the opportunity to look at the hand the way the Renaissance artists did and to discover things about it in relation to our own lives that will be helpful. And that's part of the reason that I decided it would be good for me to come here and try to sell you all on the hand. Now, we really begin to as a friend of mine says, drill down a little bit on this idea about why the hand is so important, probably with Leonardo, even though nobody who lived at the time of Leonardo knew anything about what he was discovering about the hand. But Leonardo wanted to know something about how the hand actually worked, because as an artist, he wanted to be able to represent the dynamism of the hand. And he as an engineer, thought the way to do that is to see how it's actually put together. And when he got down, when he really drilled down, what he found was this very, very striking anatomy of the arrangement of the flexor tendons that were really responsible for this grasping, manipulative capacity of the hand. And so he actually said, I'm going to spend a lot of time figuring out how this thing works. He wasn't so much interested in how to represent the hand as an artist, but he was really interested in discovering how it worked. He did not succeed, but he started the process. The next really important moment, about 50 years later, is when Andreas Vesalius, who was a young army surgeon, and he was actually the court physician to Emperor Charles V, he started a revolution in medicine. Prior to that, any dissections that had been done were done by prosectors. They were done by barbers. They were done by people who were not really intelligent people. They were just technicians. And the professor of anatomy would read from Galen, the textbook of anatomy that had been written in about the 1st century AD. So now in 1500, it's really good to think of your book having a long life, but 1,500 years is ridiculous. Now, Claire Sherman, who's an art historian in Washington, D.C., organized an exhibition called Writing on Hands, which was at the Folger Library in 2000. And she has quite a discussion. If you go to my website, you will see a link to the website that they put up, which illustrates much of what was in that exhibition. Anyway, we could spend a whole hour talking about that one diagram of what Vesalius was doing to the act of being a physician, and it all crystallizes in his dedication, in which he said that if the physician does not do the dissection himself, if he does not develop the evidence with his own hands, he doesn't know anything. And that was really the beginning of the scientific revolution in medicine. But it's interesting also, think about Leonardo, Vesalius, who was an artist, and now 100 years after Vesalius, Rembrandt, in one of the most famous paintings of his career, is doing the same thing. He's illustrating to a group of other doctors. This is Dr. Tulp, actually Nicholas Tulp, doing what they sort of do in medical television now, which is getting people to come and watch dissections. People are fascinated with the body, but he's again exposing the flexor tendons. This is where the big secret lies in what it is that makes the human hand what it is. Now, in 1833, Charles Bell, who's a contemporary of Darwin, is given the commission to write a treatise to prove the existence of God. And as a comparative anatomist, he chooses the hand. The mechanism of the hand, its vital endowments are so perfectly matched to the brain that it has to have been designed. This is the argument of the existence of a designer from finding something that must have been designed. And this is what he said. At the end of it, he says, the hand, there's no thought of its complexity as an instrument which make it subservient to the mind. We use it as we draw our breath. Unconsciously, we have lost all recollection of the feeble and ill-directed efforts of its first exercise. Darwin himself, writing 40 years later in The Descent of Man, says essentially the same thing. Even to hammer with precision is no easy matter. To throw a stone with as true an aim as a Fuegian, he's talking about the natives of Tierra del Fuego, requires the most consummate perfection in the correlated action of the muscles of the hand. So we've now come to the point in the middle of the 19th century, which is really quite an exciting time. This is, for the weavers here, that's when Jacquard was stimulating Babbage to think of the computer. Would have been interesting to be alive then. 1500 would have been a good time. 1850 would have been a really good time. But anyway, we still don't have the evidence of how it got that way. That's the next step. And the next step takes a long time to come. It doesn't really come until the middle of the 20th century when a fossil skeleton is dug up in Ethiopia by young researcher Donald Johansen. And this prehistoric 3.2 million years ago creature, chimpanzee size, chimpanzee brain size, but clearly a habitual upright walker and with an unusual hand is discovered. Alan Alda and Mary Marsky, who is an anthropologist at Arizona State University, are discussing on a program called Scientific American Frontiers, is about what actually is happening with the evolution of the hand beginning with Lucy. And it really comes down to is that beginning with Lucy, it becomes possible, and you might want to sort of play around with this with your own hand, it becomes possible to rotate the index finger and the third finger in such a way that you can cup an object like a rock.
Is this Lucy's hand or one of her relatives?
This is a composite set of hand bones from Lucy's relatives. Beautifully preserved, very nice joint surfaces. And some of the interesting things are at the base of the index finger, where there are 3 joint surfaces. And these surfaces all are oriented in a way that they are in modern humans. And they are all different from the way they are oriented in chimpanzees. And the different orientation would have allowed a little bit of rotation of the index finger and a little bit of
rotation, meaning what?
Rotation toward the thumb. And when you rotate the index finger toward the thumb, this helps you to grasp.
Lucy's ability to pick up and firmly grasp an object like a round stone opened up a whole new way of earning a living. Chimpanzees throw stones, but underhand and not very accurately. Lucy's ability to hurl a rock hard and on target brought her into a different league.
Would Lucy have been able to pitch?
She could have. She had the anatomy to do it, and if she had practiced, she would have been able to pitch. She had a hand that could have grasped the ball and controlled it. And she also had a pelvis that allowed for balance of the trunk on the hind limb. So she could have used her trunk as leverage in pitching. As we watch these pitchers, they're rotating the trunk and then they're putting on the brake with their gluteus maximus muscle so that the arm accelerates in a whip-like way. And she had both of those features, both in the hip region and in the hand. So it takes a lot of practice, but she could have done it.
As a result of that, Lucy would have been able to throw an irregularly shaped object. Now, Mary Marsky also, speaking, sort of integratively, systematically, pointed out and discovered that the pelvic muscles also permit the acceleration of the upper body in a rotational way so that, as a baseball pitcher did, the ball can be accelerated through a turn and the brakes can be put on so that the motion stops and the ball can be released.
Our ancestors from the time of Lucy, 3.2 million years ago, may have been hot on the mound, but they would have had problems at the plate. Here's a chimpanzee letting off steam with a stick. He's swinging it with great determination, but his grip is quite different from that used by a baseball batter. Our old friend Tujo the orangutan uses the same grasp as the chimp, with all 4 fingers curled into his palm. Neither modern orangs nor chimps, or it turns out even Lucy, can do what we can do. Rotate our little finger across the palm to touch the thumb.
The advantage of having this rotation can be seen when you hold something cylindrical, like this bone, where you grasp things in a trough across the palm with the little finger and the thumb strongly opposed. And this allows you to bring the tool down in line with your arm.
It's interesting. I was taught in tennis to squeeze these last two fingers as I hit the ball.
Yes.
And that gives control.
Yes.
And that's what they were able to do when they shifted over to this kind of a finger.
Yes.
So that's the beginning that Lucy gave us, which is very different from the chimpanzee hand. Here are three very, very important changes in the hand, beginning with Lucy, that ultimately we inherited with what were essentially critical functional improvements. One is what she calls metacarpal mobility. That is to say, the ability of the hand to close in such a way that it forms a cup and a recess. And part of that is really so critical that everybody knows about the opposable thumb. What Mary Marsky has written about is the opposable pinky. That is that in addition to the thumb being able to cross the hand, the fifth finger and the tip of the fifth finger is able to cross so that it touches the base of the thumb. So that the grip that everybody is familiar with in holding a hammer, in holding a sports implement like a tennis racket or a golf club, those grips are only possible in the human hand. Secondly, the muscles at the base of the thumb, it isn't just a matter that the thumb crosses the hand. The thumb is also, with Lucy and with our ancestors, is longer than it is in the chimpanzee. And I'm going to show you a photograph that makes that clear. And so the independent movements, the tendons and muscles around the base of the thumb, give the thumb much more independent movement. Finally, the joint surfaces in the wrist allow for forces to be changed in such a way that when you hold an object in a particular way, it is gripped forcefully and yet can be accurately moved. So there are many, many small, seemingly small changes in the anatomy which change the function of the hand in such a way that we can do things with our hand that all the higher apes were unable to do. So here's a quick comparison, and I just take a look at the illustration on the right. This is a small crescent wrench that's being held by a chimpanzee on the right, is not at all connected to the gorilla on the left. But notice that when the chimpanzee, and this is really critical to note, the chimpanzee has what's called a suitcase grip, that when the fingers fold into the hand, they fold in a parallel way. But notice this wonderful curve with the human thumb, and the human thumb is much longer than the chimpanzee thumb. The fingers are almost the same size, but the critical difference is that the third, fourth, and fifth fingers make this oppositional movement so that they curl not straight down toward the wrist, but they curl into the base of the thumb. So one of the consequences of that is that ultimately we're now able to oppose the thumb to the tips of the other four fingers. We are the only creatures ever who have ever been able to do that. There's a nice illustration here of somebody doing mitral valve surgery in which, and by the way, this is multisensorial as well, David, that the surgeon is operating in the dark and entirely by touch is breaking up adhesions in the mitral valve. This is the way mitral valve surgery was done. Michael Motion, who was the choreographer for the Cirque du Soleil, is a juggler who designed a triangular device, and he had a a juggling act, which you don't get to see, in which the balls go against all three sides and he catches them. Glenn Gould playing a little Bach. This is another illustration of not a grasping movement, but it's a movement in which the hand is extended and the hand is actually pushing down against a surface. This is a little bit more like the sort of grooming movement that goes on, but this is another movement that we have adapted, and in fact there is an evolution of a technology that takes advantage of that capacity. I became very interested in the difference between the harpsichord and the piano, and what happened when you play a harpsichord, the artist presses a key which releases a quill that is spring-loaded and that strikes a string and makes a note. But the harpsichordist cannot change the loudness of the sound by hitting the keyboard any harder. And in 1709, when a release mechanism was designed for the piano, it became possible simply by changing the amount of pressure or force, of the striking force of the key, that you could change the dynamics of the sound. Okay, now we're going to move from, so now you know about the hand. Okay, now I'm going to quickly try to connect this with what's happened in our world with the arrival of digital technology. This is a late 18th century diagram. You probably can't see it, but here's a guy with a terrible headache lying on his left side, and the doctor is dutifully drilling a hole in his head with a trephination. This is actually 2003. I rounded up the numbers, and they're doing a procedure in which a great deal of computer-assisted and machine-assisted engineering is allowing the neurosurgeon to get into the exact part of the brain where a probe is going to be used to treat the area of the brain that is responsible for the difficulty that we call Parkinson's disease. Remember the mitral valve surgery? One of the most popular operations that's being done now is being done by cardiac surgeons who are using a device, interestingly called a Da Vinci, that was developed at Stanford, in order to operate tools that are being mechanically operated, and the surgeon is looking through a microscope, but he's not actually touching the instruments. And I gave a talk for a Society of Interventional Cardiac Surgeons, non-invasive cardiac surgery, in which they said it's great having this stuff, it's better for the patient, but they no longer get to put their hand on a beating heart anymore, and it's problematic for them. There's something that has gone out of that job. So now getting a little closer to you, now I actually think the more I talk to Leah and the more I read about Jacquard, the more I think that you could trace the whole history of modern civilization by looking at weaving. But I didn't really know, and I'm going to hold up a book. This is my current favorite book by James Glick, who wrote the book about Feynman called Genius, and he wrote a book about chaos. This one is called The Information. And there's a great deal in the book about all of these people, and it's really important to know that what we call the computer revolution, the information age, and information theory really all started with the idea of labor-saving device, so that the sort of either, number one, the physical difficulty and challenge of simply doing repetitive things over and over again could be taken over by a machine. But then this sort of breakthrough idea that belongs to Babbage and Turing, and also, of course, Ada Lovelace, Byron's daughter, who really did most of the heavy thinking for Babbage, and may have been the first computer programmer. Really changed our lives. And they did it in a way which they weren't thinking of in the sort of compartmentalized way. Well, this is left hemisphere, this is right hemisphere, but nevertheless, this is actually what we're doing, and they're always looking for new ways to make it easier or better. So I visited Leah a week or so ago, and she has this image on her wall, and it's made with her loom. And the intriguing thing, when I saw it, I said, was this from Matrix? What's going on? The figure on the left is somebody who's actually looking at the image of this face, and the stuff coming off of her head, those are EEG wires. So something really strange is happening here. And it came to me, this is neurology really got started, functional brain imaging got started, with the challenge of understanding language loss. The very first neurological localization was done, again, about the same time, the middle 1800s, when a French patient with a language loss was found to have a lesion in the left hemisphere, in what is now known as Broca's area. So I'm kind of familiar looking with these diagrams, but what Leah is doing now, you can see down on the bottom, she's looking at people looking at photographic images, and then at images of the same subject, but done in a woven pattern, and looking at the differences in how they respond to it. So something really amazing is happening, and I see this as very, very constructive. This is something that you didn't expect. This is an unexpected outcome, which that's the kind of thing that I really like. I also think there's another point which you all should be aware of, and you look at these images. They're more than just pictures of artificial hands and arms. There's something really evocative about these, and there's something cultural about them. In the middle 16th century, when Ambroise Paré, who was a military surgeon, was thinking about what do we do about people who've lost their hands, he invents, much as Babbage did with his analytic machine, a device that has inside it what is essentially a clock, which is what they were thinking about in terms of inner mechanisms in those days. Now we have something else. We have a computer chip, and the person who really wanted us to look at this is the person who put an egg between those fingers, because everybody knows that that's a problem, is holding an egg without breaking it. Now, I became interested about 2 or 3 years ago about the problem of of amputation. There's a war going on, as you all know. It's not nearly as bad as people think, because in the Civil War there were lots more amputations than there have been in Iraq. I'm not going to invoke my. I lost 1 minute on frustration, so I get 5. Okay, so I would just want to show you this guy, Jesse Sullivan, whom I've met, was an electrician. He was a lineman working in Chicago. He got electrocuted, lost both of his arms, and he now has 2 replacement arms. There is an enormous. There are hundreds of people all over the world now who are working on this problem. And the thing that I want to get you to sort of focus on is that while the engineers and computer scientists and people are working on this problem, they're really looking at it as an engineering problem. 2 years ago in the summertime, I was at a meeting at the Philip Johnson Glass House on the new, is this the 21st century, a new renaissance? And I was there with Alan Chachanoff, who teaches at the School of Visual Arts. And I said, Alan, I'm trying to figure out if you could get kids, high school kids maybe, or even junior high school kids interested in this problem. And you look at all this kind of stuff, and you go into these graduate research laboratories, and you say, there's no way that you could get a kid involved in this problem. But Alan said, okay, we'll try it out. So he put together a program for one of his master's classes. And I invite you to look at their website. If you can't read that, you can just Google SVA prosthetics. But this is actually the website, the design/sva.edu/prosthetics. And I'm just going to show you a few images. These are graduate students of his who had 10 weeks in a 3D design problem to come up with an object. They had to actually create an object that could be used in some way useful to or helped us understand something about the loss of an arm and the replacement of an arm. So this is actually a piece of jewelry that was designed by one girl to make people aware of what it's like to have something metallic. It's a sort of a wonderfully expanded bracelet. Another student was interested in body image, and she makes this object to sort of communicate what it's like to change your body image because of the loss of part of your body. One of the girls is a swimmer, and she said nobody is thinking about swimming, and so she designed a wetsuit. By the way, and again, this is multisensorial experiential, all of these kids who were just designers went to a VA hospital, and for the first time in their lives, they sat down with people who had lost an arm. Before that, it was always just, somebody that you pass on the street that you don't want to get too close to because who knows what could happen. One of the students made a set of hands that were in mudra postures for contemplation. And one of the ones that I just love, which I'll show here, was Tubers and Zot's interactive arms. These were toys that could be put on the arm of kids so that they could sword play. So these kids really took to this project in a very, very big way. And we're having continuing discussions about this right now. This also goes on at the Maker Faire. I want to finish very quickly just by leaving you with what I think is, I think we adults and professionals are survivors. We're figuring out how to integrate digital technologies into our lives. Some people can't and don't, and they end up seeing the doctor because they have broken bodies and spirits. There are people like that. But I see many examples of great things coming out of people who creatively use and don't throw away what they knew and what they did, but they manage to implement it, as Leah has done and as many, many other people have done. And we all have to understand that it's a bit like the moment when the telegraph was invented, and one of the unintended consequences of the invention of the telegraph was that people discovered that there was such a thing as the weather as a global phenomenon, because people began to learn instantaneously that the weather's like this here, the weather's like that there. This instantaneous communication actually changed the way people think. And it's this kind of continuous reintroduction of the old with the new and this intermixing, I think, that creates the possibilities that exist. But I don't think we've really thought through this problem. This is from 1560. There are 80 different games going on in this wonderful Bruegel painting. And we're reminded that Froebel invented these gifts for children. There are sets of instructions, the idea that the child is going to learn how to manipulate objects. There is very, very solid science behind the fact that young children manipulate objects in a very particular way in order to gain information from them. Susan Letterman, Roberta Klatsky did this work in 1987, and it is profoundly important, because what it says is that we are physically predisposed at an early age to begin to handle objects in order to gain control of them and to gain information about them. People who work on Oliver Braddock, who's at Oxford and who studied infant vision and visual development, told me, he said, look, I'll give you the whole story in one sentence. He says, from the age of 6 months to 12 years, what babies do is look at their hands as they're manipulating objects. That is the project, the developmental project of the second half of the first year. This book, which I brought along with me, Heidi's Horse, was written by Sylvia Fine, and it's a collection of drawings made from the time her daughter was about 2.5 or 3. And she talks in this about when circles begin to collect lines and how images are turned into animals and so forth. And right on the money, my granddaughter started doing this, circles within circles and then lines out of circles. I called Sylvia when I saw this, and I said, man, it was just like the clock. This is absolutely the way it happens. I have a few copies of this book. I'm going to turn these over to Mark. But if any of you don't know, Sylvia has just brought out a new edition of this book, Heidi's Horse, and it's a wonderful way of looking at this as a developmental issue. So here's our problem right now. For lots and lots of reasons that have nothing to do with anything about who kids are or how they learn, a lot of stuff is being marketed aggressively to make sure that kids, it's a little bit like your example of, the baby Einstein stuff is like, here, we'll show you, as if children left alone with 2 million years of evolution behind them would not, in fact, do exactly what they need to do in order to become smart. So it's time I downloaded some information to you. Go ask your search engine, and my favorite, I only draw with software. Too bad I can't do this one, but a friend of mine runs a carpentry program at a school in Mill Valley, and they build a dulcimer. And in this film, there is an example of the kids stringing the strings, putting them on the peg, tightening the peg, and you look at the movements of these kids, and of course look at their faces, and then of course they're going to learn how to play them. Here's kind of this is the take-home message. The skilled human hand is not merely a more polished version of the ape hand. It is an entirely new musculoskeletal organ that has radically transformed upper limb movement, the brain, and the cognitive life of the species. It functions at the center of human development and cultural evolution in the lifelong process of physical, cognitive, and social action. Now, the first time I did a book reading, somebody said, so are you saying that kids without hands are stupid, or people without hands are stupid? So that began a discussion. The thalidomide problem that happened when I was in medical school proved that that you have to look at two time scales. Number one, evolutionary time scale. The human brain grew up with a hand, and if you happen to be born without hands, then the brain is going to go looking. If it doesn't find one, it's going to invent a pair of hands. And the legs, the toes, the dexterity of those people proves that this is the way that we are predisposed to interact with the world. I'm fascinated now. This actually started the Society for North American Goldsmiths, that I got interested in body alteration and stuff like this. And this is one of the reasons that I think that prosthetics, human prosthetics, is not just simply a cosmetic matter at all. People have become used to, especially young people, very used to body alteration, and they're very excited about some of these devices. They don't care what it looks like. They want to be able to do stuff with it. I guess we're done. Thank you. One last thing that I just want to point out, on the tables there are a couple of copies of a report that was published just about a month ago by the New York Hall of Science about a Maker Faire event that was held about getting kids interested in science. And there are more of those that are available. We only had enough for a few on the table. But the Maker Faire movement is, I think, a very, very important one. It's not just vocational education. We're looking right now critically at how, like as with the design school kids, how to really make involvement and also, I mean, this was another Marchand, the work of the people who are doing so much more than developing propositional descriptions of what they're doing as they learn from one another. So I'm really excited to hear about the anthropology of mentorships and apprenticeships. So thank you all. Look forward to talking to you later. Bye.
Since we didn't have time to ask questions of David Howes and Frank Wilson, we'd like to take the 15 minutes right now before lunch. I'm sure there are questions that you'd like to ask from these learned and fascinating men. So please step to the mic and ask them. Unfortunately, our moderator, Ian, had to leave, so. All right, I'll join you. That's fine. Does anybody have any questions, please?
We would like to know what the 33 senses are.
This is an article in New Scientist not so long ago. Basically, the sense of touch has been dismembered in all kinds of ways. So you find interoception, like proprioception, kinesthesia, all the senses of movement and of the inside of the body. You've also got, it turns out, that color, there may be different senses for red and blue and so forth. There actually are evidence of that. Umami is a fifth taste. So the more scientists look at the senses, the more they split them and find these hidden senses. It's an interesting question. If Aristotle, his understanding of touch didn't include movement, did he never dance? Is it that he's translating in that way? Indeed, when you look at the history of the senses, and at least how they're represented in literature, it's remarkable that there's this explosion of the number of senses in the 18th century when you have common sense coming on as a sense, a public sense, the sense of beauty. There are a whole series of inventions. And so the sensorium is this incredibly shifting construct. Each age sort of constructs it in its own, with its own priorities and concerns. Speech is a sixth sense in certain estimations in the Middle Ages. So, the number of the senses, and that's just within the Western tradition. When you go across traditions, you find 2 senses, you find 8, you find a whole series of further understandings. And I think that it's a reflection of the way in which, it's not so much how many senses we have as how we use them that counts. And there are a number of different ways of deploying the senses that we see in this way.
Just I can't answer this. I haven't read the article, but I wonder if the sense of belonging is part of that.
That hasn't come up yet, but you're welcome to propose it. And
I just did.
Yeah, okay.
Any other questions?
Yes, I was wondering if you could please speak about the intelligence of the hand in relationship to consciousness or to personal awareness. Is it a separate thing? Or it seems sometimes, just to give the point to my question, I tend to work in the technique that's extremely repetitive. And it seems like there's something that's happening subconsciously, does not necessarily require my entire brain.
There's a lot of, and I'm not remotely an expert on this subject, but I know a lot of people who are very interested in the subject of consciousness and self. It's a pretty hot area of research in cognitive neuroscience at the moment. And it's something that I'm really quite interested in from a number of perspectives, most of all because I'm interested in how kids come to decide who they are. And I have a pretty strong feeling that it has a great deal to do with their own evolving capacity to observe their own behavior and observe at the same time other people's responses to them. I've become interested in a not frequently seen but often talked about phenomenon in the neurological literature called the Capgras syndrome, which has to do with the experience that someone who's quite familiar to you and about whom you have strong feelings is actually an imposter. In very severe cases, it can appear to the person who has this disorder that they themselves are an imposter, that the person I'm looking at in the mirror is not really me. There is a neuroscientist, a clinical neurologist in San Diego named Ramachandran, who's interested in the neurology of much of what's being discussed here, including things like mirror image, phantom limb syndrome. And he wrote a paper about 10 years ago about Capgras syndrome. The typical situation is just that somebody wakes up in the hospital, they've had a brain hemorrhage or they've had a head injury, and now finally they are awake enough, conscious enough in that sense, in the sort of just mechanical sense of being able to receive sense data from around them and to locate themselves in a place. They're conscious in that way, without the question of identity really being involved in it. And somebody like their mother comes in and the patient says to the doctor, that woman is wearing my mother's clothing and she's fixed her hair up, but she's not really my mother. For a long time, it was thought that this was a really, in the Freudian sense, a psychological disorder having to do with disinhibition and then having forbidden fantasies. Ramachandran would point out that sometimes people would think that their dog was an imposter and that you'd have to imagine that the person had hidden bestiality that they now had to suppress because they had been cortically disinhibited. But Ramachandran suggested something else, which was that the person simply was not having the normal emotional response to the realization that somebody who was emotionally meaningful to them was actually there. So if the woman who walks into the room looks like mom, she talks like mom, she wears her perfume and her clothing, but I don't feel the way I usually feel when mom is here, I sort of reject the idea and I think, well, it has to be somebody who's imagining that. Well, I happen to know the woman who's the head of the piano faculty at Juilliard, and I was telling her this story, and she said, I think we have something like that with our most talented students. She gave this example, and I'm sorry I'm being a little long-winded about this, but there is a point. Get to it. And she said that these young, really gifted pianists come in and they can play like you simply cannot imagine. But often they just simply don't have the experience of the whole world of performance practice, and so they may do something in a way that, while it's flashy and it's wonderful, that ain't the way it's done. This is the tradition of playing this particular passage of this particular Beethoven sonata. So the teacher will say to the student, yes, that's wonderful, but you need to do the fingering this way because this brings out the inner voice, which sort of recaptures a theme that was, 5 measures earlier, however they talk. And the student can learn how to do that, and they do that, and they do it immediately, but they never play the piece again. And the teacher says, why? And the answer is, because it's not me. So that in this evolution of this skill, this sort of becoming the whatever it happens to be, that there's a whole enormous appropriation that includes the appropriation of the awareness of what it is you're actually achieving and what it is that you are expropriating. That is the kind of self that is not recognized in a performance that someone else has laid on you. And so the person who really authenticates themselves and has this artistic idea, this artistic sense that before I'm done, I have to really be able to say it's me. And indeed, the other side of that is I discover who I am by having the experience of saying, I like that, I want to give that away. So I think that one of the things that we really need to do more and more and more in education, and I think the hand, to get back to come back to your question, what does the hand have to do with it, is that in the process of doing the kinds of things that you do as you get better at a skill, you have to become an objective, critical observer of what it is that you're doing. I first learned this with my daughter after recitals when she was not interested in what the audience thought about what she played. She said, well, I meant to do this, and this is what happened. I meant to do this. That's what happened. So what I began to appreciate was that she was taking on the responsibility of deciding for herself how it was going. And part of that was she was creating, if you will, an evaluator persona. This is the critical judge. It's not a critical in a negative sense, but the one who decides, is this really me? Is this really worthy of what I am capable and of what I intend to do? And I submit to you that one of the great failings of our public education system is, and I learned it takes a long time to learn how to be good at that. Artists spend a lot of time learning how to decide whether what they are doing really is what they want to do or not. Now, if kids grow up in an environment in which their opinion not only doesn't matter, but it is repeatedly suppressed and replaced by completely irrelevant evaluations that are laid on by somebody outside who isn't interested in what's going on inside the kid, but who's interested in deciding who gets into what college, who gets how much salary for having succeeded. So that this whole issue of assessment, that is part of the process of creating and evolving and seeing yourself and wanting yourself to evolve, is really part of both consciousness and what I think is embedded in what I think, or what I decided I would imagine you were thinking when you talked about the intelligence of the hand. In other words, you at the end of this process, you want to be able to authenticate not only what it is you're putting out, you are also authenticating something that you call a self, that's me.
I agree with what you're saying in part, and yet I wonder whether, in a sense, you're overemphasizing a kind of very Western perspective of artistic invention as an individual exercise, and looking at kind of outside of traditional fine art practices to kind of craft. I guess I personally value kind of more non-Western regions or practices where we've actually identified there that collective reenactment, is creative still. So there's a wonderful recent book by Marcus Boone called On Copying, which questions this whole Western narrow focus on art making as a kind of individual self-realization, where the artist becomes a kind of develops their individual judgment and an individual identity, and instead, perhaps one of the great things about craft, I personally feel, is that it's a space where that collective practice still kicks in.
Right.
And still is valued. I don't know if maybe this is a question more for the anthropologist.
Just very quickly, I do want to, but I want to make sure that we don't misunderstand one another. I don't think that a person who sits in another city and writes standardized tests is part of the collective that you're talking about. And I think that, for example, when kids work together and build stuff in garages, when they play music together, they're doing exactly what you're saying. And I do understand that, and I take your point. I'm just simply trying to focus on something that absolutely does not happen at all, which is any of the stuff that you're talking about, or any of the opportunity for the person to develop a self within a community, which is something that I think, the sense of being, the sense of self and the sense of community, which have to grow up together. It's ineffable. I have no idea. You're not going to find it in the brain anywhere. But anyway, so your turn.
Well, I think that, Frank, you have brought out very strongly the interactive nature of the relationship between brain and hand, and then also hand and environment. And so, it's that relational perspective that is so key. And so, even though there's an accent on the individualism in the West, it's a denial of all of the relationships that are actually embedded and implicit in any kind of artistic endeavor. So we can be in denial, we can ignore the relations, but I think that comes back to that idea that I was suggesting as well about the painter. It's a painter's eye, or a period eye that we talk about, and then handicrafts as assimilated to touch. These are obfuscations of the intersensory relations that are actually going on the ground, and so each tradition is going to construct those somewhat differently.
We have to have just one short question, and okay. I also just have a short question for you too, but we have 1 more minute.
Okay. I was really interested in the sociality of tactility, I believe is what you said. The hand as a socialized object, or right hand, left hand, hierarchized. I'm thinking of Dante's first canto, my left foot always lower on the hill. I just would like you to elaborate on that just a little bit more, if you could.
Okay. Perhaps you could include the thing that I'm interested in asking you about, which we already talked about.
Okay, well, I mean, this is indeed the body as model for society, or indeed for cosmos, is a common theme. And one of the facts about, sort of, for example, late 19th century understandings of the senses was a very racialized perspective. And just to bring that out, interestingly, as a kind of conceit, Europeans, in particular, sort of biologist by the name of Lorenz, not Conrad Lorenz, an earlier one, Lorenz Oken, understood the senses in terms of a hierarchy and classified the races accordingly. So at the top was the European eye man, and next came the Asian ear man, and then at third place was the Indian, the native Indian, North American nose man, and then I'm afraid Malaysian, I think, was the taste man, and then at the bottom was the black man as the man of skin. Now, this is an extraordinary way in which you've got a use, again, of the supposed difference between the senses as a model for racializing all these things. And these are social constructions, and this is what I think we need to, above all, understand. When I began this research on the senses, I went out with an idea sort of very much inspired by Marshall McLuhan, that different societies had different sense ratios, and you could sort of turn up the visual here, turn down the volume, and so forth. And I very quickly discovered that no, different societies construct the senses and then live them differently as well, so that there are no essential features. Sight is not necessarily spatial and hearing temporal. There are all kinds of transformations on those. The idea that we have of of the gaze in the West, which has been very influenced by Foucault in terms of panopticon and so forth, is very different from the idea of darshan in India, where in fact the deity, you want to be in their gaze when their eyes are pricked open because of the beneficial influence that can flow in that way. So it's a mutuality of the gaze as opposed to the single one. So just to say that the extraordinary plasticity of the sensorium is what really matters here. And I've sort of been resisting the sort of domain of cognitive science in the last while, which seems to me to have appropriated much of this domain for itself. And I like the interactive perspective that Frank is bringing out, which is as much the mind is in the environment as it is in the head, in order to try and overcome the sort of privileging of cognition that is a conventional Western fascination. And as we expand the domain of the senses and understand the extraordinary relations and practices that go on that way, I think that we can enrich our art and enrich our crafts in significant ways.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you, Frank and David. Thank you very much.